Because when you look at a photo, a lot of times you automatically just kind of want to say, okay, well, I see this, and then move on, right? This kind of causes us to stop and think about it for a second, right? Wait, what am I actually looking at? Why might this be the case? And it kind of helps us to draw bigger questions that we can bring up in the group. So what I'm going to do is, for those of you who completed it, I'm going to show you what that looks like on the book. Sure, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Am I looking from my box?
You can look at that one, so you can see what that one looks like. You can kind of look at each other, and then I'll find yours. Yours printed out pretty good, though. Want me to bring your chair over?
I got it.
Okay. I don't even want to mention how many times I tried to make this copy and not mess it up, because that would be embarrassing. Oh, what? If you want to.
Yeah, this is good.
And you can kind of look at the pictures that are left to it, because that's going to be an important thing to.
About 7. 10 years, 10,000.
This has literally become my favorite book of the year. I just got it and I was just like, this is crazy.
I can see, I can see if I can kind of like read it on a bookstore or Apple or something.
Yeah, and the cool thing is that it's just a picture, it's a book full of graphs. It's just a book full of graphs. So this is the other one. So this looks at illiteracy.
Oh, my box.
No, I think You're okay? Can you be my clicker? Can you do, I'm gonna have you do my clicker. Okay, clicker, okay? And then yours is cool because yours has the most color. I like yours a lot. I also love maps. So where did I say that this conference took place?
Paris.
Yeah, so it happened in Paris. So 1900, I want us to kind of think back, and I'm going to kind of explain what was someone in 1900 living in Paris, if they were to say, if you were to walk up to them on the street and say, conjure an image of an African American, most of them would have thought of people who were sharecroppers. So people who lived on, basically in many cases, former plantations. Now we didn't talk too much about this last week, I just wanted to show a couple of pictures of what sharecropping would have looked like. So sharecropping was the process. Now we talked a lot last week about people who voted and then went to change their names and then got married and tried to kind of reset their lives. We didn't even really look at people who were messaging in newspapers, begging and saying, my family member is this, the last time I saw them was at this plantation, please tell them their brother or their sister is in Maryland and they're looking for them, right? So we see that happening. But in terms of economics, like what do most enslaved people do? A lot of them end up staying on their plantations just because they don't necessarily know where else to go. They become paid workers, but many of them turn to sharecropping, which essentially meant that they were rented out a plot of land in which they would produce a certain amount of food for a certain amount of period. They would share some of that product with the person who owned it, which was typically a former plantation owner. But oftentimes, it ended up being another form of slavery, just because oftentimes the products that they were asked to produce were almost so high that they ended up owing more and more and more, which they consistently just have to keep paying with their labor, right? And so that's kind of what sharecropping ended up being. I know that last week Mr. Warren brought up the fact that a lot of people also, you had to have a job in order to be, like, to not be in jail. And so they end up making it where, like, if you don't have a job, then you get in trouble. And then, so some people became convict leasers, which means that they basically ended up back on plantations through providing their labor just because they have been accused of a crime. Really interesting family story that I could share. And I encourage all of you all to do this, talking to older people. So I talked to my grandmother, she's like my best friend. And she was telling me about the fact that her mom, my great-grandmother, remembered when her father came home from slavery. And I thought that was really interesting because when I went back to look at my family history, my great-grandmother was born in 1932. So I thought, well, how could she have remembered someone coming home from slavery? And it was interesting because I began to realize she was talking about convict leasing. And that's literally what they had called convict leasing in the family is slavery, right? Which kind of shows just how parallel you can kind of see those two systems. So if you're going back to Paris, if you were thinking about what state African Americans were in the South, you would think of these images. These are the pictures that will come to your mind. People who were farmers, in many ways, didn't necessarily have a lot of access to education, were largely rural. And so when W.E. Du Bois goes to Paris, he's not only going to share statistics, as you all are going to talk about the statistics that you all saw, but he's also going to challenge these notions. Last week, we talked a lot about different primary sources and how we understand the African American experience, and photographs are a really important form of that, of how do photographs kind of challenge notions. And so with each of these photos, what we can see is that each of these photos includes a picture of an African American. So for example, I'm going to start off with yours, if you wouldn't mind. So can you tell us about what your graph is, and then I'll show the picture?
So my graph is called illiteracy, and it's kind of like a line graph, I don't know. And I think that it was kind of implying that the literacy rate the percentage of illiterate people has increased since 1860. That's what I'm getting from the graph, I don't know.
No, it's okay. And another thing is, some of these graphs can be a little bit confusing, so just keep that in mind. You're not like, it's not confusing. I was a little confused too when I was looking at some of these. So this is what this graph says. So it says in 1860, and if you go down, it says the percentage of the people who are illiterate. And in 1860, no, that's totally fine. No problem at all. So in 1860, we see 99% of the African American population was illiterate. Now, that was actually not necessarily true, right? And that's why I wanted to also say that even though these are really, really beautiful photographs, they're not necessarily all true. And also, access to real concrete statistics was also really hard to get. So it's not as if he was trying to lie, but nonetheless, we can still look at these to kind of get some more information. There were a lot of literate African Americans, particularly living in the South, who were free, right? There were a lot of African Americans throughout history who have really made a lot of names for themselves. One of them, for example, being Benjamin Banneker, who actually drew out the map and layout for Washington, D.C. He lived during the time of the founding of the country, so he actually wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson. He was one, for example. Now they were not many, right? But they were there. But it says 99% were illiterate. And what we see is that over time, in 1870, we see 92% are illiterate. By 1880, you go over here, about 81% were illiterate. And then by 1900, which is when this map was what they're trying to talk about, he says that only 50% of African Americans were illiterate, right? So if we're taking this graph at its kind of like core, what's happening to the illiteracy rate?
It's decreasing.
It's decreasing, right? Now, why do you think that the illiteracy rate is decreasing based off of kind of what we talked about last week? What are most African Americans doing?
Getting an education.
Yeah, right? They're going to school. They're founding their own universities, which is going to bring us here to yours, right? We have this picture, and this is young women seated at the steps of a building at Atlanta University in Georgia. So I don't know if you all want to pass this book around to kind of look at some of the pictures that were attached to all of these different statistics.
Excuse me, can I run to my mom real quick?
Yeah.
Thank you.
What are some of the things that you see when you're looking at that picture? Not so much just the picture.
There's only, like, most of them are white in the picture.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult because it's a black and white photo, but a lot of them are African American, but they are lighter skinned, which many of them would. But I think that's a really interesting point that you said a lot of them look white, right? Not just in terms of like a lot of their dress, of the way that their hair is, kind of like that. That's an important point to kind of take a look at. But most of these women were African American, with the exception of this woman here. What are some? If you were to say like, what do you get from this picture? What does it make you feel? In comparison to maybe thinking about those.
It makes them look like rich, kind of, or wealthy, have more money.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Wealthy, rich, definitely we would probably say educated, right? And this is something that we see a lot in this collection, is not only the statistics, but what do the photos do, or what are they trying to communicate, right? They're trying to communicate a different image of African Americans. No, not all of them are sharecroppers. Some of them are also in universities. Some of them are also getting their educations. So let's go ahead and take a look at yours. So what do you see?
Mine is the African American children that are enrolled in public schools. And in 1870, it was at 10,000. And by 1878, it was already at 72,000. So it shows that, like, it shows that how much it increased, like kids being able to have an education and stuff.
Yeah, right? So we see a lot more African American school children who are enrolled in public schools during this time period. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find the picture. And I just saw yours, so let me make sure I notate that. But I don't know, do you want to show it to everyone? So many pictures. So here it is, right? And what we see attached is, this is a photo of elementary school teachers of a bunch of students in Washington, D.C. who are school children. You can kind of see they're all dressed in their best. This is the school that they would have been in Washington, D.C. A lot of African Americans still remain in Washington, D.C., still to this day. But you can see this photo. Owen, do you want to share yours, just saw it?
Yeah, the amount of African American teachers in the school system in 1886, 1889, 1893 and 1897. And
I don't know. So, in addition, yours is right here. So, what we have here is a class, and this is a class in bacteriology in a laboratory at Howard University. So we see a lot more African Americans kind of like in this section. And what we again see is an expansion of more and more people who are kind of like moving towards this, right? So we see a lot more African American school teachers in the system. And then lastly, I kind of want to end off here with yours, because yours is really interesting. If you want to just kind of summarize it.
It's basically just the distribution of African Americans in the United States, and there's like not a lot of people, and there's like not a lot of people in these parts. It's labeled up here. There's like it says less than one in like all the yellows, and so like most of the African Americans are located like right here.
Yeah, right. And this is a really important part of this story, is that a lot of African Americans, even in the year 1900, still resided in the South. They resided specifically in these areas, not so much up here in the north, but really down here, really heavily concentrated, Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina. And that's going to remain really until the Great Migration, which hopefully we can kind of talk a little about. There's just a lot of African American history that we can talk about. But I love this collection just because I think it's not necessarily just about the numbers, although the numbers can help us to understand some important parts about African American history in terms of the rise in education. There's some other photos here that kind of talk about the rural populations. There's some other graphs in here that kind of break down the value of African American property, which we also see starting to expand. There's one graph that kind of starts off saying that African Americans in 1860 would have held about maybe like a couple $100,000 in property. And by 1900, that number, specifically in Georgia, had rose to 12 million. Now again, that's saying a lot, right? So they're not only kind of, although a lot of people are sharecropping, there is a diversity there. And there is starting to expand a little bit of wealth, which unfortunately we do see kind of like thrown back with events such as Tulsa, which again is something I might write down just for you all to kind of learn about. That kind of like helped or worked against kind of what this progress was. But the reason I wanted to start us off with W.E. Du Bois when we're talking about Garvey is that this is kind of the state of African Americans, right? So there's a huge diversity in terms of what people are doing. Some people are sharecroppers, some people are university students studying bacteriology at Howard, right? There's a lot of diversity there. And a lot of people are really looking to, how do we set ourselves up in the best position? And as you can probably imagine, many people have many differing opinions. And so I wanted to kind of take a look at what are some opinions. Can you click to the next slide for me? Oh, you can move to the next one. Next one. Next one. Okay. Yeah. It's okay. Here we go. And the three people we're going to talk about today are these really important figures. We've already kind of talked about W.E. Du Bois. We're also going to talk about Booker T. Washington. And then probably most importantly, is what this section is going to focus on, is this man by the name of Marcus Garvey. So, just a little bit about W.E. Du Bois. This collection is really probably the best way to kind of describe how he saw African Americans. He believed in this concept of the talented 10th, right? Which basically was this notion that there are going to be a certain level of elites in the African American society. Those who are the most educated, who are the most brilliant, the doctors, the lawyers, the writers, the bacteriologists of our society. He called them the talented 10. And it was his understanding that they were the ones that were really going to help African Americans get out of the position that they were in. He believed that in doing that, not only would they make a lot of good in the world by focusing and putting all his money into the elite of African American society, but they would also help to kind of change people's understandings of African Americans, which he thought was kind of a huge root of the problem. Now, some people see him as an elitist. In many ways, he was. He has a lot more work. I'm happy to hear that, Owen, you read his work in school.
I was only like a couple chapters. I didn't read the whole book, though.
Yeah, I encourage you all to read him. He's a really important figure in kind of looking. He brings about this notion of double consciousness, which he's probably the most famous for. This understanding that we as African Americans, or people who are African Americans, or I would say argue all people of color, not only have to be aware, we have to always be conscious in two different ways, right? So we have to be aware of our surroundings. We have to be aware of two different cultures, right? Two different understandings of a workplace. Just to kind of summarize, these are really important. And a lot of people do kind of go for that, right? They really invest in their children's education to get them to be that talented 10th that's going to get them out of poverty, right? It's going to be the most elite of the society that's going to challenge racism. You then have another understanding with a man by the name of Booker T. Washington. Now, he gets a lot of flack during his period, and he also gets a lot of flack later on in his life. He kind of thought that people had to assimilate, right? That African Americans really needed to earn their respect through really being the best that we could possibly be, to be business owners. So he caused a lot of conferences, in particular. He really tried to focus on it. And again, a lot of people don't necessarily like that, hence the reason why he gets a lot of flack when people talk about Booker T. Washington. But nonetheless, that was a viewpoint of a lot of African Americans. I also forgot to mention that W.E. Du Bois is also one of the founders of the NAACP. We have a different voice that comes out of this time period in the form of Marcus Garvey. Now, Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica. He came over to the United States. And immediately we start to see is he really starts to drum up a lot of, he gets a lot of his support from people who were very disillusioned. And that term disillusion means that they had kind of really, they didn't believe, let's just say they didn't believe necessarily W.E. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, that things would change, right? If we just keep doing our best, then things are going to change. He captures a lot of World War I veterans, people who had literally fought and did the right thing, as people would think would be something that would gain you respect. World War I veterans go over to Europe, they fight in a war for the country that isn't treating them well, hoping that when they get back, they'll receive the same respect, and they don't. There's several stories of African American war veterans being beaten, lynched, in the aftermath of World War I and World War II and Vietnam. And so what he kind of stands for is a different notion. It's for Black pride, right? Determination. We can build the power through our people. We don't necessarily need to assimilate into a society that already doesn't love us. Let's assimilate into our own, right? So he's all about building. He's about building industries. He's about collectivizing or getting together with a lot of African Black people all across the world, in the Caribbean, in Africa in particular. And so this is kind of his viewpoint of kind of what people can kind of move forward to. So with these three ideologies, people do exercise that by getting involved with different groups. The NAACP, a lot of people joined the NAACP with W. Du Bois. In terms of Garvey, his group was called the United Negro Association, the United Negro Improvement Association. This is a picture of their meeting house in New York. And they had over 720 branches in the United States. So a lot of people joined the Garvey movement. Kind of fun facts, Malcolm X's parents were Garveyites as well. They were heavily involved in in that organization, which may have also contributed to Malcolm X's father's murder. What people believe he was murdered because of him, what he was seen as kind of a rabble-rouser, which hopefully you all will definitely learn more about Malcolm X. But his father was very involved with this. And so what I wanted to do today is I want us to kind of take a look at or read before we go to lunch, because I know lunch is here. I wanted to look at what were the goals of the UNA. This is, where's the other one? Is everyone okay? Do you want to talk about thoughts of outside? Let's go outside, because I think you all are tired and kind of cold. I don't need my PowerPoint until we get back.
Should we bring our pictures?
Yeah, why don't you bring your pictures?